On an average summer weekend, 11 million people visit a reservoir an hour north of Atlanta, spread their towels on its beaches, and wade into water that has killed more than 700 of them since 1956. The signs at every swim area say the same thing: no lifeguard on duty, swim at your own risk. Almost nobody reads that as a body count. The people who pull the dead from the bottom of Lake Lanier will tell you something the brochures never do. Lake Lanier draws roughly as many annual visitors as Disney World's Epcot theme park. A comparison, the Army Corps of Engineers, which owns and operates the reservoir, has made in its own documentation. It is a 59 square mile body of water in the North Georgia foothills, with 76 boat launches feeding into it, 20 designated swim areas, and a peak season crowd density that packs entire coves with houseboats, ski boats, jet skis, pontoon rentals, and swimmers sharing the same few hundred yards of murky surface. Over the same 3 decades of state record-keeping, the neighboring Lake Allatoona, managed by the same Army Corps, drawing comparable summer crowds, located 40 miles west in the same Georgia heat, recorded roughly a third of Lanier's drownings. Same state, same summers, same agency, same kind of visitor. One lake kills at roughly 3 times the rate of its neighbor. The volume of people is a factor. It is not the explanation. Something about this specific water, this specific reservoir, is doing something the others are not. And that something is not a curse. It is engineering. The illusion of safety at Lake Lanier is more completely constructed than at almost any other recreational destination in the American South because it is built from the lake's own appearance. The water is blue-green and inviting. The surface temperature in July reaches 85 degrees. The beaches are groomed. The marinas are professionally operated. Every visual cue the lake presents at surface level communicates a managed, benign environment. Every one of those cues stops at the waterline. The first illusion is that Lake Lanier is a lake. It is not, in the conventional sense. It is a drowned landscape. The reservoir was created in the 1950s when the Army Corps of Engineers finished Buford Dam on the Chattahoochee River and let the water back up over more than 56,000 acres of North Georgia. Farmland, forest, county roads, houses, churches, a speedway, bridges, wells, and the remnants of a community called Oscarville. All of it went under. The valley was not cleared before flooding in the way a visitor would imagine. The Corps condemned the land through eminent domain, relocated some structures, and let the water rise over everything that remained. Much of what stood in that valley was left where it stood, and the water covered it like a lid going over a box no one bothered to empty. The Emergency Dive Response Team, a volunteer unit operating under a Memorandum of Understanding with the Georgia Department of Natural Resources, has documented what that means in practice. According to their dive missions, anything below about 35 feet was simply left in place. A 1950s forest is still down there, upright and intact, its branches strung with decades of snapped fishing line instead of leaves. Sonar surveys have confirmed submerged roads with their surfaces still intact, building foundations with walls partially standing, the span of an old bridge sitting more than 100 feet below the surface, and the concrete grandstands of the long-buried Gainesville Speedway. During the severe drought of 2007, Lanier's water receded far enough that the Speedway grandstands reappeared above the waterline, a buried racetrack rising out of a shrinking lake, offering the surrounding communities a glimpse of what the water usually keeps hidden. The second illusion is that the water is uniform. It is not. Lanier looks like bathwater at the surface in July. 85 degrees, blue-green, inviting. A few feet down, it is a different lake entirely. The sun warms only the top layer of the water column, called the epilimnion. Below, a sharp boundary called the thermocline. At Lanier, this sits around 40 to 45 feet in summer, but the water stays shockingly cold year-round. The Georgia Department of Natural Resources' own data on seasonal lake turnover confirms that the deep layer, called the hypolimnion, is stagnant, cold, and dangerously low in dissolved oxygen. The dive teams report bottom temperatures consistently between 42 and 45 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that even in August they wear full cold weather dry suits rated for near freezing conditions. Between the warm surface layer and that frigid deep sits a boundary that a swimmer can cross in a single stroke or a single step off an unseen ledge, and Lanier's bottom drops off without warning. The old valley terrain beneath the water, ridges, ravines, old road cuts, means a person can be standing waist-deep in warm water, take 2 steps forward, and find themselves suspended over a submerged hollow 40 feet deep with water 30 degrees colder than what they were just standing in. Cross from the warm layer into the cold one suddenly, and the body goes into cold water shock. It is not a gentle chill. It is an involuntary gasp reflex that can fill the lungs with water before the brain processes what is happening. Heart rate spikes, blood pressure surges, muscles seize. Even a strong swimmer can inhale water and go under in seconds. It is silent, it is fast, and it happens in the exact water where families are swimming and children are playing on an inflatable 10 yards away. The third illusion is that the lake's dangers are visible, that a swimmer who is paying attention can see the drop-off coming, can read the water, can recognize a hazard before it becomes one. The water at Lake Lanier makes this categorically impossible. A Hall County Sheriff's Dive Team deputy described it plainly. Within about 20 feet of shore on even a gentle slope, the murk sets in and visibility becomes very difficult. Much beyond that point, it is virtually impossible. All light vanishes around 40 feet down. Below that depth, it is simply black, the kind of blackness that swallows a dive light at arm's length. The deepest point of the lake is 163 feet, and the Emergency Dive Response Team has described the deepest zones as a sensory void where divers navigate entirely by touch, running gloved hands along submerged structures to orient themselves. The lake bed itself is not sandy or rocky, but fine silt, almost like dust, and the slightest contact with a fin or a hand blooms it into a cloud that erases what little visibility remains. One diver compared it to kicking flour off a kitchen floor in a dark room. A diver on the emergency response team carries at least 2 cutting tools on every descent for entanglement in the submerged forest. The team trains for that entanglement by practicing how to cut themselves free while blindfolded because the water offers them nothing to see. These are trained professionals equipped with dry suits, tethered to safety lines, carrying multiple knives, and expecting every one of these hazards before they enter the water. The ordinary swimmer waiting in on a Saturday afternoon cannot see the drop-off, cannot see the branch, cannot see the old fence line or the rusted wire, cannot feel the cold coming until they are already in it. That is the machine. Submerged forest to snare, black water so the hazard is invisible, and a hidden cold layer that seizes the body the moment it drops below the thermocline. No single part of it is visible from a beach towel. Every part of it is knowable, measurable, and documented in exhaustive detail by the people who dive this lake. Sergeant Chris Temple of the Hall County Dive Team has told reporters that diving in Lake Lanier is probably one of the most dangerous things he has done in his career. That statement deserves to be held for a moment. A trained public safety diver equipped with professional equipment, tethered to a safety line, expecting every hazard, describing the lake as among the most dangerous things he has done in his entire professional life. The recreational visitor, standing knee-deep on a Sunday afternoon, holding a beer in one hand and a float noodle in the other, is in the same water. They have not been briefed on the thermocline. They have not been told about the submerged forest. They have almost certainly not read the sign, and the sign, even if they had read it, would not have told them any of this. One veteran dive sergeant described stepping forward on the bottom and beginning to drop unexpectedly, throwing his arms out and feeling brick walls closing in on either side. He had fallen into the open well of a submerged house that he could not see, not with his light, not with his mask, in total darkness, and had to inch his way back out one handhold at a time. That well had been there since before the dam was finished. It had been there for every one of the 700 deaths that followed. It was waiting in the dark the same way it had always waited, and it will be waiting for the next 11 million visitors, exactly as it waited for the last 11 million. Below the physical hazards sits another layer of the lake's identity, one that has been woven so thoroughly into the death narrative that the two can no longer be separated without deliberate effort. And separating them matters because the conflation has made the lake more dangerous, not less. The documented history is this. In September 1912, in Forsyth County, Georgia, a white woman named May Crow was assaulted and later died without ever regaining consciousness or identifying her attackers. 3 young black men were accused. One, Rob Edwards, was lynched by a mob in the town square of Cumming. 2 others, Ernest Knox and Oscar Daniel, were convicted by an all-white jury and executed. In the weeks that followed, armed groups calling themselves Night Riders burned black churches and homes, shot into houses, set off dynamite, and issued ultimatums giving black families 24 hours to leave. Confronted with organized terrorism, virtually the entire black population of Forsyth County, more than 1,000 people, including the residents of Oscarville, fled their land within weeks. At least 58 black landowning families abandoned farms, trades, and businesses. Property was seized. The county remained effectively closed to black residents for decades, well into the 1990s, making it one of the last surviving sundown counties in Georgia. That racial cleansing is not legend. It is confirmed by the Atlanta History Center's Forsyth 1912 Research Initiative, by Patrick Phillips' historical account, Blood at the Root, by census data showing Forsyth County's black population dropping from nearly 1,100 to effectively zero between 1910 and 1920, and by every credible source that has examined the record. The popular story says Lake Lanier was deliberately created to drown a thriving black town, sealing the crime under the water forever. The Atlanta History Center, which has researched this question directly, calls that specific claim a myth. Oscarville's black residents were driven out in 1912, more than 4 decades before the water rose in the 1950s. By the time the Corps began construction on Buford Dam, the community had been gone for a generation. The land was taken through eminent domain to supply Atlanta's drinking water and generate hydroelectric power, not to erase a living town. What is true is heavy enough on its own. A black community was violently erased from that ground. That same ground was later flooded, and the reservoir was named for Sidney Lanier, a Confederate-era poet. The racial history of the place was, quite literally, submerged. The haunting, as one historian put it, is not really about ghosts. It is that this is a place where some of the country's most brutal racial violence played out, and then the evidence was put underwater. The myth matters here for one very practical reason. It has become the primary lens through which people explain the deaths. Every drowning gets folded into the ghost story, the curse, the vengeful water. Social media posts circulate each summer warning people to stay away from the haunted lake. That framing, comforting and eerie as it is, quietly does something dangerous. It converts a set of concrete, preventable, physical hazards into fate. A life jacket does not protect against a curse. It does protect against a cold water drop-off. Calling the lake haunted is, in a precise and practical sense, just another form of not being warned, because the deaths themselves are not mysterious. That is the part that gets lost in the ghost stories and the viral videos and the late-night conversations about cursed water. The Georgia Department of Natural Resources incident reports show causes that are painfully ordinary, repeating with a consistency that looks nothing like fate and everything like a known fixable problem. The list is short. No life jacket, alcohol, open water, misjudged. A man slips off a marina dock and goes under. Ramon Diaz Soria, 27, jumps from a rented tri-tune during a birthday celebration with his life jacket on, but not properly secured. The vest floats to the surface while he sinks, and his body is not recovered until the following evening. Matthew Mayo, 73, falls from his boat when his seat comes unbolted in May of 2024. Jim Hansard, 76, is found deceased in 13 feet of water near his own dock a week later. Hassani Weidmund, 46, drowns in September while trying to swim to his boat from the shore in full view of his family. A 20-year-old drowns in the swimming area of the lakefront Margaritaville Resort over Memorial Day weekend. Nationally, the United States Coast Guard found that in 2023, roughly 3/4 of all recreational boating deaths were drownings, and approximately 87% of those drowning victims were not wearing a life jacket. Georgia mirrors that pattern exactly, and Georgia law does not require adults to wear a life jacket on the water, only children under 13. The single most effective piece of survival equipment on a lake where adults routinely die without it is entirely optional for every person over 12 who steps onto a dock or wades past their knees. Alcohol runs through the numbers like a current. The Georgia DNR recorded 275 boating under the influence cases statewide in 2023. During one July 4th weekend in 2024, 15 of the 27 BUI arrests across the entire state were on Lake Lanier alone. The death toll clusters exactly where you would expect it to cluster if these were preventable accidents rather than acts of a supernatural curse on Memorial Day, the 4th of July, and Labor Day, The weekends when the crowds are biggest, the coolers are fullest, and the boats are packed most tightly into the same few coves. In 2023, at least 8 people drowned at Lanier, matching the highest total in 4 years. By mid-May of 2025, the state had already logged 27 drownings and 5 boating fatalities, with safety analysts projecting what could become a record-breaking year for water deaths. The cruelest detail is how quiet it all is. The public image of drowning, the thrashing, the shouting, the raised arm, is largely a myth. Real drowning is almost always silent and fast, a person slipping below the surface without the breath to call out. Rescue experts call it the instinctive drowning response. The body fights to keep the mouth above the waterline, the arms press down laterally to try to lever up, and there is no air left to shout. On a lake with no lifeguards, in water that no one can see into, in a cove loud with boat engines and portable speakers and children laughing, a swimmer can go under a few yards from a crowded dock and not a single person notices until someone asks 20 minutes later where they went. The lake does not announce a death, it simply closes over it. 11 million visitors do not spread evenly across a calendar. They compress into the same handful of summer weekends, into the same popular coves, onto the same water. Lanier is roughly 59 square miles of surface area, with 76 boat launches feeding into it. On a holiday Saturday, the popular coves fill beyond reasonable capacity. Houseboats rafted together, ski boats cutting figure eights, jet skis threading between them, pontoon boats idling, kayakers drifting, and swimmers treading water in the gaps between all of it, sharing the same few hundred yards. The Coast Guard consistently traces boating accidents to 3 causes: operator inattention, excessive speed, and inadequate lookout. Lanier concentrates all 3 into a tight, murky space where no one can see below the surface. A ski boat's wake can swamp a small craft or knock a swimmer under without the driver registering that someone was in the water, because a human head against a dark lake surface is nearly invisible until a hull is directly on top of it. The lake's fluctuating water level makes the crowding worse. The Army Corps manages Lanier's level for its original purposes: water supply for metropolitan Atlanta and hydroelectric power generation. And those priorities mean the lake can drop several feet between visits. When levels fall, beaches narrow, navigation channels tighten, and submerged structures that normally sit safely below the keel line creep closer to the surface. A cove that was open and deep last month can be shallow and obstacle-strewn this month. Add alcohol to a crowded, high-speed, low-visibility waterway with an unstable bottom contour that changes from week to week, and the result is exactly what the incident reports describe over and over. It is not bad luck, it is arithmetic, and when it goes wrong at Lanier, it is uniquely hard to undo. On most bodies of water, a drowning is a race against minutes. On Lanier, even the recovery can stretch for days or weeks. Every hazard already described works against the rescuers just as powerfully as it works against the victims. The dive teams search by feel in absolute darkness among branches and tangled fishing line and the walls of structures that nobody cleared before the water rose. Witnesses to drownings are often unable to give precise locations because they were panicked or intoxicated or simply could not see where the person went under in the murky water. The Emergency Dive Response Team holds the record for the deepest recovery ever made at Lanier, 112 feet below the surface, and the longest time a victim remained on the bottom before being found, 86 days. They are called out on the order of a dozen times a year to Lanier alone, and some victims are not recovered for weeks. The cold at the bottom slows decomposition and delays the buildup of gases that would normally cause a body to become buoyant and rise. Remains can lodge against submerged debris, wrapped in fishing line, wedged against a tree trunk, settled into a building foundation that has been sitting on the bottom since the Eisenhower administration, and stay trapped until seasonal temperature changes alter the water column's buoyancy balance, sometimes causing bodies to surface months after the initial drowning. Local authorities have said plainly that retrieving victims from Lanier can border on impossible. In the lake's grimmest cases, they are never recovered at all. A lake that hides its hazards from swimmers hides its dead from the searchers just as completely and with the same indifference. This brings the story to the question that the ghost narrative has, for 7 decades, made it easier not to ask if the hazards are this well documented, if the causes of death are this predictable, and if the toll has been running at this pace since Eisenhower was president, why has so little changed? Lake Lanier is owned and operated by the United States Army Corps of Engineers, which built the dam and manages water levels for flood control, water supply, and power generation. Recreation was never the lake's intended purpose. The Corps' own documentation says as much, even though the reservoir now draws as many annual visitors as a major theme park. The Georgia Department of Natural Resources patrols the lake and enforces boating safety laws, but its game wardens cannot be everywhere on 59 square miles of open water, and their primary mandate is wildlife enforcement, not drowning prevention. County sheriff's offices provide dive teams. Volunteer organizations like the Emergency Dive Response Team handle some of the most dangerous recovery work. 3 layers of authority, none of which considers preventing recreational drowning its primary mission. The Corps manages water levels. The DNR enforces speed limits and BUI laws. The counties and volunteers recover the dead. Nobody, in any official capacity, is primarily tasked with stopping the drownings before they happen. The result is a destination visited by more people each year than the population of Georgia itself, operating with 0 lifeguards at any of its 20 designated swim areas, 0 legal requirement for adults to wear life jackets, and a safety message that lives on websites and brochures that the overwhelming majority of visitors have never read. The swim at your own risk sign posted at every beach is not a warning in any functional sense. It is a legal instrument, a sentence that formally transfers liability from the entity that owns the water to the person standing in it. It does nothing to mark the drop-offs that send swimmers into 40-degree water. It does not explain thermal stratification. It does not mention the submerged forest or the silt or the fact that drowning looks nothing like what people think it looks like. It says, in polite bureaucratic language, whatever happens from this point forward, it is your problem. The trend lines are pointing in exactly the wrong direction. Georgia's boating fatalities doubled between 2020 and 2024. BUI arrests have climbed sharply. Boating incidents and drownings are starting earlier in each season, creeping from the traditional Memorial Day opening into April and March. And the institutional response remains almost entirely reactive. More law enforcement patrols on holiday weekends, more press releases urging visitors to wear life jackets and stay sober, more after-the-fact recoveries by exhausted dive teams who train blindfolded because the water they work in offers them nothing to see. The ghost story is, in this context, not merely inaccurate. It is functionally protective of the conditions that produce the deaths. If Lake Lanier is haunted, then the deaths are fate, the product of supernatural forces that no regulatory change, no life jacket mandate, no engineering intervention could address. If Lake Lanier is a drowned landscape with a cold thermocline and no lifeguards and a legal adult life jacket exemption, then the deaths are a policy outcome, and policy outcomes can be changed. The ghost story makes the second framing harder to hold. It is not a conspiracy. It is the path of least institutional resistance, the framing that asks the least of the agencies that manage the water and the lawmakers who set the rules. Here is what the 7-decade record actually shows, assembled from the incident reports and the dive team accounts and the DNR statistics and the Corps' own documentation without the ghost story in the way. Lake Lanier is a 59 square mile reservoir built over a drowned valley. Its bottom contains a 1950s forest, building foundations, submerged roads, and a buried speedway. Its thermocline drops water temperature by 30 to 40 degrees within a single step off an unseen ledge. Its visibility below the surface is effectively zero. It draws 11 million visitors a year, operates 20 swim areas with no lifeguards, and imposes no life jacket requirement on adults. Its death toll since 1956 exceeds 700, running at roughly 10 to 20 per year, at a rate far above its neighboring reservoir under the same management. The causes of death are consistent, well-documented, and preventable. No life jacket, alcohol, and a lake whose surface reveals nothing about what lies beneath it. The lake is not trying to kill anyone who enters it. It is simply being what it has been since Buford Dam closed in 1956, a drowned landscape in a Georgia valley with a cold layer that seizes the body without warning, a forest that holds everything that falls into it, and a visual surface that gives no information about any of it. It does not adjust its thermocline for holiday weekends. It does not raise its visibility for the family who drove up from Atlanta on a Saturday morning. It does not warm its bottom water in August. It maintains today the same conditions it has maintained for 70 years, and those conditions have been producing the same outcomes for 70 years at a rate that looks nothing like an act of God and everything like a known, solvable problem that has simply not been solved. It doesn't care that you spread your towel on the beach. It never did. Subscribe, because the wilderness doesn't warn you, and someone should.